Welcome to Inside American Politics, the podcast that digs beneath the surface to uncover the hidden lives and legacies of America's most intriguing figures. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and today we're turning the spotlight on a woman often overshadowed by her iconic husband, yet whose quiet strength and influence helped shape the nation's earliest years. This is the story of Martha Washington, not just the First Lady, but the first to define what that title truly meant. And remember, this is just one of the many stories waiting to be uncovered on Skoob, your AI-powered podcast studio. Download the Skoob app now on the App Store or Play Store and start listening today. Now forget everything you think you know about America's First Lady. This isn't the story of a quiet, dutiful wife standing silently beside her famous husband. This is the story of a shrewd businesswoman, a luxury-loving spender, a reluctant public figure, and a woman who called herself a state prisoner while living in the nation's highest office. Let's start at the beginning, but not where most people think. Martha Dandridge's story doesn't begin with George Washington. It begins with her as an 18-year-old bride who would become one of the wealthiest women in colonial America. Picture this: a teenage Martha somehow convincing one of the most difficult and wealthy men in the American colonies to accept her as a daughter-in-law. Daniel Parke Custis's father was notorious for his challenging personality, yet Martha delivered what a family friend described as a prudent speech that completely won him over. That's our first clue that Martha was no ordinary colonial woman. By her mid-20s, tragedy struck. Daniel died, leaving Martha not just widowed, but extraordinarily wealthy. And here's where the story gets interesting. While many colonial planters, grown men with years of experience, struggled with the basics of turning a profit, Martha managed the vast Custis estates with a prowess that surpassed most of her male contemporaries. She was so competent, in fact, that years later she would advise her newly widowed niece with words that reveal her true character. "Handle all of your affairs personally. Dependence is a woeful state." Martha Washington understood power, and she understood independence. But like many widows in 18th century America, she didn't cling to that independence for long. Enter George Washington, tall, ambitious, but notably not particularly wealthy. When Martha married him, George immediately assumed control over her property. It was the law, but it was also the beginning of what would become a very expensive partnership. Almost immediately after their marriage, both Martha and George went on what can only be described as a luxury spending spree. George meticulously drafted itemized lists of Martha's desires to be sent to London: silk stockings, white satin shoes, gold shoe buckles, beaver hats, and later, purple kid gloves. But Martha's vanity truly shone when it came to her hair. She ordered 2 fine ivory combs, 2 large tortoiseshell combs, gauze caps, and, get this, 2 pounds of perfumed powder. If you've ever seen those iconic portraits of Martha with her brown hair adorned with white beads or pearls, now you know she was serious about her appearance. Meanwhile, George was dealing with his own frustrations. As a former regimental commander turned tobacco planter, he harbored deep envy watching British victories during the French and Indian War. His military dreams hadn't died. He ordered 6 busts of legendary military figures from London: Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Charles XII of Sweden, Frederick II of Prussia, Prince Eugene of Savoy, and the Duke of Marlborough. When his London agents couldn't fulfill this request and suggested literary figures instead, Homer to Milton, Washington promptly rejected them. Generals, not poets, filled his dreams. But here's where things got complicated. The London merchants held all the power, and they knew it. They sent substandard, overpriced goods, knowing colonial consumers were at a disadvantage. Washington found himself receiving broken plows missing essential parts, outdated merchandise, and damaged shipments. By the second year of their marriage, George's letters to London grew laced with blatant sarcasm. He complained that instead of fashionable goods, they received merchandise outdated by centuries. The frustration was building, and so was the debt. When the Revolutionary War began, Martha proved herself to be what one might call a Spartan mother, fiercely supportive and remarkably resilient. She joined George at Valley Forge and other frigid winter encampments, but this wasn't just about wifely duty. While officers and their families lived in considerably better conditions than the common soldiers, Martha took on a crucial leadership role. She organized the officers' wives in caring for the troops, knitting socks, tending to the sick, and hosting staff and visitors. One visitor, Elizabeth Drinker, who was lobbying for her exiled husband, described Martha as a sociable, pretty kind of woman, though she somewhat reductively referred to her simply as wife. But Martha's social adeptness was about to be tested in an entirely unexpected way. On May 12th, during the Revolutionary War, Martha found herself witnessing one of the most unusual diplomatic encounters of her life. George was meeting with 6 Delaware Indian chieftains, trying to prevent further tribes from defecting to the British side. Martha watched this peculiar proceeding from a carriage, accompanied by Lucy Knox and Katie Green. As befitted a refined Virginia lady, she was simultaneously fascinated and appalled by what she saw. George's approach was characteristically direct. "Brothers, I am a warrior. My words are few and plain, but I will make good what I say." He disparaged the British as braggarts and praised the French as reliable allies, declaring, "Now the great King of France has become our good brother and ally." But Martha's perspective was different. In a letter to her daughter-in-law, she described watching General Washington and his servant Billy Lee riding alongside the mounted Native Americans. While she admitted some were impressive in appearance, she thought most resembled Falstaff's unsavory companions, and commented on their peculiar horses and accoutrements. She understood George's diplomatic strategy, but couldn't help thinking the Indians resembled potential cutthroats. This glimpse into Martha's private thoughts reveals something important. She was observant, opinionated, and not afraid to express views that differed from the official diplomatic line. Fast forward to 1789. George has become president, and Martha, now in her 50s, faces her greatest challenge yet, becoming America's First Lady with absolutely no roadmap to follow. Upon arriving in the bustling capital, Martha discovered she was to play a central role in what she called a meticulously orchestrated political display. Barely a day passed before she was hosting dinner for congressional leaders. The next day brought her inaugural reception at the prestigious Cherry Street mansion, a significant gathering she hadn't even been involved in planning. The pace was relentless. By early June, Martha confided to her friend Fanny that since stepping foot in the city, she hadn't enjoyed even half an hour to herself. But there were perks that amazed her, like having a professional hairdresser. "My hair is arranged and styled daily," she wrote, "and I have attired myself in white muslin clothing for the summer. If you could see me now, you might think I've become quite fashionable indeed." The capital was captivated by Martha's charm, which perfectly counterbalanced George's naturally reserved demeanor. She even won over her toughest critic, Abigail Adams, the vice president's wife. Abigail wasted no time expressing her admiration, writing to her sister about Mrs. Washington. "She welcomed me with elegance and courtesy. Her attire is simple, yet each piece is of the finest quality. Her hair is white, her teeth are flawless, and she is of shorter stature." But beneath this successful public facade, Martha was struggling. Despite her pragmatic approach to her role, a shadow of unhappiness remained. She harbored what she called a quiet rebellion, feeling confined by the limitations placed upon her. By late October, she confided in Fanny with words that are heartbreaking in their honesty. "My life is dull, and I am out of touch with the happenings of the town. I liken myself to a state prisoner, restricted by boundaries I dare not cross." Think about that phrase, a state prisoner. This is the First Lady of the United States describing her own life as imprisonment. Her solution was stubborn resistance. She resolved to remain home more often than not, a subtle defiance of her imposed schedule. Even her commentary on New York's fashionable circles carried this undercurrent of dissatisfaction. When sending a watch to Fanny, she described it as of the latest style, while quipping about the transient nature of such trends. Her physical stature didn't help her feel powerful in these grand settings. Being shorter in build, She had to get her towering husband's attention through less formal means, like tugging on his sleeve. Whether Martha longed for her past independence as a wealthy widow remains unspoken in the historical record, but the clues are there. Even her renowned hospitality became subject to restrictions. George preferred to limit social life to official events, state dinners and receptions that were widely described as monotonous. Martha frequently remarked that the role of president's wife should suit someone younger and more vivacious. Not everyone appreciated her either. Thomas Jefferson regarded her as somewhat weak and possibly lacking in intellect, though this criticism holds little weight considering Jefferson's reputation for chauvinistic views, including his infamous advice to his daughter about avoiding the outdoors without a bonnet to prevent ugliness, lest they love her less. Here's something most people don't know. The Washingtons' spending habits were part of a larger economic story that helped fuel the American Revolution. By the second year of their marriage, George owed a hefty £2,000 to their London merchant, Robert Carey. Washington's desire to live like a proper country squire led him to order freely from London, despite the mounting costs. The debt trap was real and widespread. Of the £4 million of debt amassed by American colonists at the dawn of the Revolution, half came from the extravagant farmers of Virginia's Tidewater region. These lavish lifestyles were precariously supported by burgeoning debts to British merchants. Rather than examining their own excessive consumption, Virginia borrowers frequently cast blame on their London creditors. Sound familiar? This financial resentment became one of the driving forces behind revolutionary sentiment. The wealthy planters who would later become fervent supporters of independence were the same ones drowning in debt to British merchants. Martha and George were part of this pattern, asset-rich but cash-poor, forever in pursuit of financial liquidity, dependent on easy credit from London that simply wasn't available in the colonies. As Martha's time as First Lady drew to a close, her reflections became increasingly philosophical. She confided to Mercy Otis Warren that her grandchildren and extended family in Virginia remained her true source of joy. "I can hardly find a replacement for the loss of such cherished company." With remarkable self-awareness, she mused, "It seems not quite right for me to hold such a position when many younger and livelier women would be thrilled." But she didn't wallow in self-pity. Instead, she resolved to maintain her cheerfulness, having learned that one's disposition, rather than circumstances, determined the greater part of one's joy or despair. When George, whom she affectionately called her old man, died at 67 following strenuous medical treatment that deprived him of nearly half his body's blood, Martha found herself controlling the estate. But she showed little interest in handling business affairs anymore. She passed away at age 70, presumably exhausted from the continuous demands of entertaining countless visitors offering condolences. A friend captured Martha's perspective on death, describing it as a pleasant journey, perhaps a welcomed reprieve from her earthly responsibilities. Martha Washington reflected on her presidential years with a tinge of melancholy, remembering those days as the time that had slipped away. So there you have it, the real Martha Washington. Not the quiet, dutiful wife of legend, but a complex woman who was a shrewd businesswoman, a luxury-loving spender, a reluctant public figure, and someone who understood both power and its costs. Martha Washington. America's First Lady, yes, but so much more than that title could ever contain. She managed estates, advised a president, and wore the weight of a nation's expectations, all while longing for a quiet life. So who was Martha Washington really? Was she a reluctant public figure or the hidden force behind America's founding power couple? And what did she truly sacrifice in exchange for history's spotlight? The story doesn't end here, and you don't have to either. Head over to the Skoob app to uncover the full, unfiltered story of America's First Lady. Download Skoob now, your AI-powered podcast companion for deeper thinking in minutes. Get it on the App Store or Play Store and keep exploring.